young woman is living in a small Concord, New Hampshire apartment with her husband and their little boy. Their marriage is rocky, and he comes and goes often, leaving Judy alone with their toddler. During those stretches, she was said to have been uneasy and fearful, convinced someone might break in. Neighbors didn't quite understand her worry until one summer day in 1975, Judy was found dead inside her apartment. In the decades since, investigators have looked closely at several suspects, some of whom have since passed away. Yet, nearly 50 years later, hope remains that modern technology might finally reveal the truth about who killed Judy. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the updated, now solved murder of Judy Lord. Before we get started, I wanted to tell you about a podcast collaborative I'm participating in. The podcast is called You Should Be Here, and this season is titled The Cases That Haunt Us. There are so many amazing, victim-centered, ethical true crime podcasts participating in this, and each podcaster is donating 2 episodes. Every penny raised from this project goes directly to a nonprofit organization working to help victims and victims' families. So go subscribe to You Should Be Here and feel free to catch up on all the previous 3 seasons while you await the drop of season 4. Can't wait to have you join me over there, and now time for the episode. As a fair warning, this episode is a little shorter because there is less out there available on this case. That happens sometimes in the older cold cases I cover. And whenever possible, I don't want that to limit covering the case altogether because Judy's case still matters and she still has family out there who have waited half a century for answers. It was around noon on Tuesday, May 20th, 1975, when property manager Joseph McVeigh reached Building 19, Apartment 4 at the Concord and Royal Gardens apartment complex. The subsidized housing complex had a weekly rent collection, and he was at the door of 22-year-old Judy Lord. Joseph knocked and waited, but nobody answered. Thinking maybe someone just didn't hear him, he knocked again. As he listened closely, he could hear the sound of a child crying. Concerned, he went back to his office to retrieve the spare key to the apartment. As he entered, there was nothing noteworthy reported on the first floor, but he could definitely hear the crying child. As he went to the second floor, he stumbled into a gruesome scene. There on the floor of the second-story bedroom was the body of a woman. She was nude and had plastic over her head. Thankfully, in the room next door, her 17-month-old son, Gregory Jr., was unharmed. McVeigh rushed out of the unit and called for police. The scene was cordoned off, but that didn't stop neighbors from gathering and discussing what could have possibly happened. Early newspaper articles show photos of neighbors gathered on their patios watching as the body was taken away for an autopsy. The victim indeed was 22-year-old Judy Lord. Judy had moved into the 2-bedroom apartment with her husband, Gregory Lord Sr., just a couple of months prior. Judy was born in Maine to Maurice and Nellie Arnold, and she had a huge family. She had 4 brothers and 9 sisters. At a point, they relocated to New Hampshire, and she lived in a town just south of Concord. She attended the Pembroke Academy for high school, but ended up dropping out before finishing. I couldn't find out how she met her future husband Gregory, but she was a bit older than him, nearly 3 years his senior. When he was 17 years old, he joined the military, and he and Judy got married. He was stationed over in Germany, and Judy spent some time behind in New Hampshire before joining him there to live on base. Judy gave birth to their child, Gregory Jr., in 1973 in Germany. The couple then moved back to the U.S. in 1975, and Judy and Gregory Sr. settled into the apartment around February or March of 75. Neighbors were quick to pick up on the couple's marital issues. Greg was 19 years old at this point, and Judy had turned 22. Judy frequently would talk about how she loved her husband, but found him immature, and the two argued constantly. These spats came to a head in early May of 1975, just a few weeks before her murder. Judy and Gregory had a serious argument and Gregory left. Or Judy kicked him out. We don't really know for sure. Gregory's grandmother lived across the way in another building in the same apartment complex, and so he went and lived with her. In doing so, he took most of the couple's belongings and furniture, leaving his wife and young son in what was described as a very sparsely furnished apartment. Gregory earned his income working at a local hospital. Judy worked as an aide at McCurley's nursing home. From what I could tell, Judy seemed to like her job and spoke with her coworkers about a lot of what was going on with her life, because they are the people who piece together information for police interviews. But according to reporting in the Concord Monitor, she left her job about a week before her murder so that she would be eligible for support through aid to families with dependent children, because she was finding it difficult to find a babysitter for Gregory Jr., and even when she couldn't afford it. According to neighbors, they thought that Gregory Sr. may have kind of moved back in about a week or so before the murder, but then he was back out again. Another interesting observation that they had was that Judy had what they described as a high level of fear of burglars. It seemed to coincide more with when she was there alone with Gregory Jr. and after her husband moved out. She would ask neighbors if they could come with her to check her apartment to ensure it was clear with nobody inside lying in wait. The neighbors would always agree to do this for her, but they did find it a little odd and a little over the top without any further context. Being that this case is 50 years old, it's hard to know for sure what she said to neighbors, if she did give them context or say what she was worried about. Was her husband violent? Had she experienced a burglary before or had someone threaten her? This is something police may know from conducting interviews, but we don't. Now that we've established a bit more about Judy and her life circumstances leading up to the murder, let's get into the crime itself and the investigation. Judy's movements on the evening prior to her murder went something like this. There was a common area in the complex where residents had set up a volleyball net. Judy had been at this, playing volleyball with people who lived at Concord and Royal Gardens until about 10:30 p.m. on Monday the 19th. It doesn't say if her son was with her or if she had left him at the apartment sleeping. That's unclear. What we do know is that after she wrapped up the volleyball game, she sat outside on the patio of a neighbor and they had a soda before heading back to her apartment for the night. And to be clear, I mean she went back to her apartment alone. Neighbors reported hearing screams at around 1:30 a.m., with one saying they heard a voice that sounded like Judy saying, "Leave me alone." One neighbor thought that the sound was coming from outside of the apartment, and one neighbor thought it was coming from the inside. When asked why they didn't call police or check on Judy, one neighbor said to the Concord Monitor, quote, "In a normal neighborhood, you'd be concerned if you heard a scream like that, but up here, it's nothing," end quote. I dug in to learn a bit more about the neighborhood, and what I found out was that it was pretty prone to drugs and crime. The townhomes were built to be subsidized low-income housing, and they were built about 5 years before Judy's murder. A later article from the early 2000s that talked about a new property owner coming in and revamping the whole place and cracking down on crime discussed how the neighborhood had been before that. In the years after Judy's murder, a 16-year-old boy shot and killed 14-year-old Greg Pope. Break-ins were somewhat common, with residents saying they were going to arm themselves or sleep with a bat under their bed. Distribution of drugs was so blatant that it took place right in the parking lots in broad daylight, but those selling drugs also took over the resident laundry areas on site as a home base, and people were too scared to go do their laundry, so they would leave the property and go to a laundromat. The playgrounds were covered in graffiti and poorly maintained. You get the picture. Unfortunately, this is the reality of where people have to live when they're having trouble making ends meet, particularly single moms at a time like this with Judy. It's still the same now, but in the 70s, her options were going to be limited, as well as her ability to earn income at a time where women were still getting more of a footing in the workplace, and divorce still had a lot of taboo. And of course, any place that has low-income housing is filled with people who are amazing. They make up the majority of the tenants. It's just that with people struggling to get by, it does breed the environment of desperation, which we know can fuel crime. Judy's autopsy revealed that she had been strangled and then suffocated. Early reports referred to it as a plastic bag, but later on, a spokesperson for the police department named Bruce Russell would say that she had been wearing a, quote, plastic-type garment that the killer had pulled over her head. Either way, that's just an awful way to die. Police were able to collect a great deal of physical evidence from the crime scene. So much so that I'm confident in saying that if this crime took place in 2025 versus 1975, it would be solved almost immediately. Gregory Jr. was sent to his great-grandparents' apartment where his father was staying. Crime scene technicians spent 2 full days in the apartment collecting evidence, taking photographs, and dusting for fingerprints. They noted that there were no signs of forced entry into the apartment, but there were signs of a struggle. Judy had fought back during the attack. Some of the physical evidence included fingerprints on a window, bloodstains on a pillow, and hair on the bed sheet. Police sent the hair off to the FBI to be analyzed. Again, this was going to be very limited. In the mid-1970s, they could do microscopic hair comparison. The routine method then was to examine hairs under a comparison microscopes and look for matching characteristics such as color, length, scale, pattern, tip and shaft damage. And by the late 70s, this was used as a strong association tool, but according to the Innocence Project, it really had a lot of risk of failure, and a lot of people were sent to prison with using this technique, going to trial with it, doing the hair comparison, and then later finding out that, they had the wrong person all along. In addition to doing the hair comparison, they could also do class level conclusions, such as saying, is it a human hair versus an animal hair? Is it a pubic hair versus a body hair? Roughly pigmented, or if it was dyed, and if it was consistent with a suspect's hair. But it couldn't uniquely identify one person. And it was said that in the era before DNA, examiners sometimes overstated their certainty, which is how we got these wrongful convictions. By mid-75, investigators told the press that they had 3 suspects who all lived at the complex at the time, and that none of them would give samples that they were requesting, which was hair, saliva, and semen. It's unclear if Gregory Lord Sr. was included in this because, remember, even though he moved out, he was still living in the complex with his grandmother. All I could find was that Gregory was interviewed in his wife's murder. He wouldn't speak to the media on the advice of his attorney, and that was kind of that. He retrieved more of his belongings from the apartment when the crime scene was cleared a few days after the murder, and that's mostly the last we hear of him. But going back to the bodily samples, 1975 was an interesting time for this ask because recent federal court hearings had forbidden body samples to be taken without consent from the suspect until an indictment had been returned. The need to have probable cause was aligned with the constitutional right against self-incrimination. Investigators on Judy Lord's case pushed this through the court system because they felt that this was going to be the key to solving Judy's case. In the time it took to do this, one of the 3 suspects came forward and offered their bodily samples as well as a polygraph test, which they passed. That suspect was eliminated. And then the FBI analysis of the hair came back, and investigators said that their findings automatically eliminated another one of the suspects, leaving just one. A little later, we'll find out why that is, but in real time, it wasn't known to the public why the second suspect was ruled out. In November of 1975, the request for investigators in Concord to be able to legally obtain bodily samples from their one suspect referred to in court documents as John Doe reached the New Hampshire Supreme Court. Investigators argued that the request was reasonable because the samples already had general physical characteristics that matched their suspect. The lawyer for the suspect argued that while that may be true, the hair characteristic could appear the same as a lot of people's, and that as a standalone, that shouldn't be enough. In the end, the New Hampshire Supreme Court quietly sided with the investigators, and within hours of that ruling, John Doe was taken to the hospital for a sample. It was at this time that investigators did finally confirm that Judy Lord had been sexually assaulted. A source close to the investigation told the papers at the time that an arrest was imminent. But here I am, 50 years later, still telling you about this unsolved case, so that obviously didn't happen. After this stir, the case went quiet. Her case was briefly mentioned in the local paper in the spring of '76 to basically update that there were no updates. And that's really how it went for decades. Judy's case would be listed amongst other crimes occurring in the area at the time. In 1985, there was an article that ran that talked about 38 unsolved New Hampshire murders over 20 years, and Judy's case was highlighted in that. In August of '89, there was another article, specific to Merrimack County, New Hampshire, that talked about their 9 unsolved murders from the preceding 20 years. And that's the thing. New Hampshire, for being the small state that it was and all of its quiet New England charm, it had a lot of unsolved murders around the time of Judy's. Some are still unsolved to this day. Just a few years after Judy's murder took place, the Connecticut River Valley murderer began his reign of terror. Within a year of Judy's murder, an elderly woman named Madeline Krause was strangled to death in her home in Nashua. And besides murders, there were tons of missing persons cases. But none of them really bore a ton of similarities to Judy's murder. In the 1989 article that gave updates on unsolved cases, there was some information shared by Bruce Russell, the former director of investigations for Concord Police. He said that in their analysis of the collections from the suspect, they matched his fingerprint to something found at the crime scene, and that the fingerprint was found on an unlocked window that was located in a way that appeared that the person slid the window open and then used it to gain entry. Russell said that at the time it just wasn't enough to arrest the man because they said it would have taken a lot more than that, and it would have been a much bigger home run had they found the fingerprint inside the apartment. In 2005, Judy Lord's cousin, Bonnie Coate, urged police to reopen the investigation and see if any evidence could be retested with the advancements of DNA testing. And as a result, they did reevaluate the evidence. And finally, in 2005, they named their prime suspect, previously referred to only as John Doe. The man's name was Ernest Stanberry. He was a neighbor of Judy Lord's at the time. His fingerprint matched the one found on the window. Ernest was also a black man, and the hair was said to have belonged to an African-American man. As such, we can assume that as they were ruling out those 3 suspects, the other 2 must have been white men. According to an article in the Concord Monitor, investigators said that he had entered Judy's apartment approximately 10 days before her murder at 2 a.m. and told her that he wanted to see her nude. Judy had reported this incident to her coworkers, and it was their impression that she was very afraid of him. I wonder if Ernest is the reason why she was always asking neighbors to clear her apartment before she'd go in. If Ernest is Judy's killer, he can't be tried. According to investigators, he was murdered in California in 1987, the victim of a stabbing. Interestingly enough, I couldn't find any record of this stabbing anywhere, and some sources even imply that some believe Ernest Stanberry was an alias. Let's say Ernest was the killer, I now just have more questions than answers. With DNA advancements, why haven't they been able to conclusively tie the case to him? Have they destroyed all physical evidence, or were samples used up? With Judy having such a fear of him, how did he make entry into her apartment that first time 10 days before? And then, if Judy was so security conscious, how was her window left unlocked? To be clear, I am not coming from a place of victim blaming whatsoever. Simply curiosity with how this behavior doesn't align with some of her other safety behavior and protocols she was taking. And what caused him to leave in that prior incident after breaking into her apartment and propositioning her? In that 2005 article, police shared they had multiple suspects, but Stanberry was the only one they named publicly. So was it Stanberry? Was he obsessed with her and stalking her? Did his infatuation cause him to enter that apartment through an unlocked window that night and this time finish up what he intended to do 10 days prior? Was it a crime of passion and someone with a romantic connection to her? Did someone see her playing volleyball maybe with men that night? Or perhaps her soda was sitting there with a male neighbor. They never did specify. And did that make the killer jealous? The DNA may end up revealing who it was, but I'm not sure we will ever find out why. Gregory Lord Sr. died of cancer in 2019. His son, Gregory Jr., was not listed in his obituary. He had remarried and had another family, and it's unclear what happened to Judy's son after her murder. This year marked the 50-year anniversary of Judy's homicide, and though her family has stayed mostly private over the years, we know she came from a huge family, and the way they grieve does not mean they wish for answers any less than those who are more public with their appeals. My hope is that in sharing this case, there is renewed public interest and that somebody comes forward with information that could lead detectives in an investigative direction, either forensically or otherwise. And now for an update. When I originally recorded this episode, I ended with contact information to report tips to the Concord Police Department. Instead today, I am updating the end of this episode with a huge break in the case. On Monday, November 24th, 2025, the Concord Police Department held a press conference to announce an update in the 50-year-old cold case of Judy Lord. Advanced forensics had led police to her killer, Ernest Gable. This Ernest is the same person you heard me refer to as Ernest Stanberry earlier. Stanberry was an alias he went by after the murder of Judy. As it turns out, that hair analysis that excluded him, well, it did so when it shouldn't have. Oftentimes, I discuss how some of these older techniques that haven't scientifically held up over time, how they have landed innocent people in jail. In this case, it wrongfully excluded the prime suspect. Now that the case was wrapping up and the suspect was identified, police were able to release more information to the public, and they did so via that news conference as well as reporting in the Concord Monitor. We learned that it's true, Judy had gone to play volleyball with friends that night in the complex, but also remember how I said that she hung out and had drinks with a couple of her neighbors? Well, the person hosting that get-together and the drinks, that was actually Ernest's wife, Linda. and the gathering with a couple of other neighbors that was in Ernest and Linda's apartment, but Ernest wasn't there at the time. When Judy was found, the curtain rod had been broken and ripped out of the wall, and the clock as well, with the time stuck at 1:47 a.m., which is just a short time after neighbors reported hearing screams and muffled cries, saying things like, "Get away from me and leave me alone." According to reporting in the Concord Monitor, cold case investigator R. Christopher Knowles told the paper that even just the day prior to her murder, Judy Lord had told friends and those closest to her that she was afraid of Ernest and afraid that he would hurt her. When Judy had gotten home that night, she did indeed have another neighbor do a walkthrough of the home and check on it for her, like I had told you about earlier in this episode. What I did not know was that part of her worry was that she had accidentally left her door unlocked, and she was concerned that Ernest was in her apartment hiding. This neighbor gave the all clear, but it's hard to say for certain that Ernest wasn't in there hiding and someplace where the neighbor just didn't look. You know, you imagine they might have looked in all the rooms, behind the shower curtain, in the closet. But, I mean, for all we know, he could have been hiding somewhere like under her bed. Or possibly he went into the unit, unlocked things like windows for later. And because we don't know the thoroughness of the walkthrough of the friend, it doesn't really close that all out. But in the end, you'll remember that Ernest's fingerprints were found on her window. So it's likely that he wasn't in there when she got home and that he came back through that window later. I've already been through the faulty hair analysis earlier in this episode, but the other forensic evidence they had was semen found on towels. By the way, the evidence collection at the time in 1975 was considered cutting edge in what they decided to preserve and how they stored it. And modern DNA testing was able to link Ernest to Judy's case in a way that was statistically highly probable. Concord police stated that if Ernest were alive today, he would absolutely be brought up on first-degree murder charges. No hesitation, so they have a pretty strong case to close. The Concord Monitor also gave a bit more reporting on Ernest Gable's violent life of crime. He had a history of sexual violence where multiple women had reported his attacks on them, where he choked and strangled them. Women had accused him of rape. He had previously been arrested for breaking and entering, assault, and drug charges. After the murder of Judy, Ernest kidnapped his 2 daughters in Fall River, Massachusetts. And then he bounced all over the country, including doing a stint for armed robbery in Illinois. His transient lifestyle makes you wonder if there are any other murders and crimes out there connected to him, where investigators have just yet to discover that connection. And it's sad that, even with his long criminal history, he was out free to rob Judy of her life and her carefree spirit in the weeks leading up to her death. Ernest stalked Judy relentlessly, and she spent her final weeks living in absolute terror and fear. Ernest would meet his end in an argument where he ended up being stabbed in the chest in Los Angeles at 36 years old. Judy's son Gregory Lord was able to watch the press conference of his mother's case being solved, and he released the following statement. "I don't remember my mother. I was young. I always keep her memory inside my heart. She will always be with me. I'm told I look just like my mom, and I'm proud of that. I've been through a lot in my life, and in the dark times, I've always thought of my mom." This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. The Cold Case Unit released some additional photos to the Concord Monitor, and I'll have those on the Instagram, so go check it out. This outcome is what I can only hope for in all of the cases I feature, and I hope seeing a case solved after 50 long years gives hope to anybody who needs it today. Thank you so much for listening, and join me for another case on Monday.